Recording. Okay, we were talking about Giotto, and in particular, we were using Giotto and the change from the older, stiffer style of the 13th century to this newer, more realistic, naturalistic style of the 14th century. We were using this to discuss these two sort of descriptive, observational elements that lead us into our investigation, right? So we were looking at works of art. We're trying to determine, explain why the artist who created it made the choices that they did, right? And what those choices, how those choices impact the meaning of the work, right? How they alter it, right? So we talked about lots of things relative to this with both of these pictures, and now we're going to start to figure out the explanation for why. Right? We sort of said what, its impact and whatnot. But why did Giotto decide, and artists of Giotto's generation, decide to abandon that very flat kind of style that we call Italo-Byzantine? We'll explain that. For something where he models in 3 dimensions, where it seems more human, right, where he emphasizes, instead of the sort of she's stiff and she's looking out at us, she is still looking out at us, but there's a tender sort of interchange that's coming through the gestures as he grabs her finger, right, as she opens her lips and breathes, right, that she's a palpable living thing. And that as you look at the painting, as you look at the panel, there's a sense that Giotto tries to make it look 3-dimensional. Really taking some efforts and some pains to make that figure look as if it's round, right? A 3-dimensional sculptural figure. Whereas our earlier artist is fairly happy kind of reiterating the flatness of the surface. And those striations on the robe really have a strong effect in making it look pretty flat. Right? Giotto's taking steps away from that. Although some things continue on, such as the gilded background. And so what we'll talk about today is sort of how do we begin to explain these things. And this is sort of the third part of what we do in art history. We talked about, observing, taking note of subject matter and style. And then what we do in an art history class, and this is kind of what separates it from art appreciation, is we really try to explain those choices within a historical context, right? The history part of art history. And so what we're going to do is now say, okay, we're so used in the 21st century to seeing works of art in museums. But obviously these were not always in museums, and in fact they were not created to be in museums, right? They were created to be seen in a very particular context. And that particular context helps us to then explain the choices the artists have made, right? All sorts of things can be explained simply based on that. Both of these pieces were painted to be what's called an altarpiece. And what that means is that they decorated a church and were placed behind an altar where the priest performed the communion service, right? Where Mass was performed. So the normal viewing for this would have been in a religious setting. And for most people, right, they would have seen it with a priest standing in front of it, the altar in front of the priest, and this hanging behind him on the wall. This helps to explain now Christ's gesture that we talked about on Tuesday, which is giving us the peace be unto you gesture that the priest gives when he blesses the congregation. Jesus is the role model, if you will, for the priest. Right? There's a connection between his gesture and the gesture you would see a real human doing in front of him. Okay? Giotto's is an altarpiece as well. But Giotto's is from an altarpiece that was a different format from the one on the right. Now, knowing that these were altarpieces helps us, again, to determine sort of how they would have been seen. The one on the right is fairly large. It's, I don't think I have the dimensions here, but it's roughly 4 feet tall or so. Right? And in churches in the Renaissance, Italian churches in particular, there was the high altar. So imagine a church interior, okay? And it's a big long hall, right? That's what basilica means in Latin, is a long hallway, right? And separated from aisles by columns, right? And so as you came in, the priest would be at the far end. Let's pretend I'm him, right? As bad as analogy that is. But here I'm sitting in front of him, right? And he's up here, you're back there, and you see it if it's the altar piece that decorates the high altar, right? And those tend to be really, really big because you got to see it from way back there, right? And even further. Now, in addition to that, on the side aisles of the church, like left and right, there are chapels, right? And each of those has a secondary altar. And there would be altar pieces for those as well, right? So the size of these helps to tell us a little bit about where it might have come from, right? This one is not big enough to be a high altar piece. It's probably a chapel altar piece, or from a smaller church even, based on a scale. Now, Giotto's picture is about like this, right? By comparison, it's about yay, right? 2 feet max, right? So that means a different viewing context as well, right? And again, these are determinate choices that the artist had made. Although probably not really a choice, but he was told to do it at that size, right? That was a determination that was made. Now, the size of it suggests something more intimate as a viewing of the piece, right? But what we know, what we presume, is that actually it was a multi-paneled altar piece. So there are 3 other works that are in different museums around the world. And we think there probably were other pieces that might have gone with this. We're not 100% sure how many. It could have been 4. But the way the guy on the far right looks directly out at us thinks you might put it parallel, have one like that on the left, right? The way the 2 guys are looking toward her suggests that there probably were at least 2 missing from the other side, also looking toward her, because you wouldn't put him with his back turned to the Virgin, right? So this is just a hypothetical reconstruction, right? And to scale, the side panels were slightly smaller, and we think they all went together because you look at the frame, right, is really similar. Right? And this was normal in art history, or in the history of art, I should say, that in the 18th and 19th centuries, after the Enlightenment and religion became less of a driving factor, works of art, particularly religious works of art, were often sold off by the churches. The money more. And then the dealer who buys it decides, well, I've got this Giotto that I can sell as 1 Giotto, or I can sell it as 7 Giottos. Right? And so they get cut up, parsed out. Right? Sometimes, if a panel is painted on the front and the back, they'd even cut it straight down the middle. And we know from craft patterns how things went together. It's kind of cool, right? So there's our piece. One of them is in Florence. One is in Boston. I can't remember what the other ones are, right? But they're all the scale works for them, right? The framing is similar. So his altarpiece was a different kind, a multi-paneled altarpiece, which means then, behind the chapel altar, it took up more space, right? So such as this one tiny little thing. Yeah.
Do you think that, I know you mentioned the previous class that the certain colors were very hard to get and very expensive.
Yes.
Do you think that played into the role of the size and scale of painting?
No, usually the size. That's a good question. So did the expense of the paint play a role in the size and scale of the painting? Yes, many times it did, but not in this particular case. Okay. But that's a really good question because sometimes we'll find that This art history class, intro to art history, you're going to see the heavy hitters, and you're going to see some of the pinnacle works by these people. You see the best of the best of people. There's a lot of crappy art out there by these artists from the same time period, right? And Giotto, by this point in his career, was incredibly famous. He worked in almost every city in Italy at one point or another. His fame had grown. This new style took off, right? And he's incredibly well known. So regardless of the cost of materials, Giotto ain't on the cheap, right? But if you are on the cheap, you do artist that's not nearly as renowned as John, right? Think about a movie director. You get Brad Pitt, or you get somebody you never heard of, right? So that's kind of the analogy here. So it can have an effect on the work of art, but not in this particular case. Right? In this particular case, the size of the work was most likely determined by the size of the chapel, right? And the taste of the person who paid for it. Now, in addition to these three other panels with half figures of saints, we also have a series of works that seem to be roughly the same dimension that show us scenes from the life or the passion of Christ, life and passion of Christ. So the nativity, the presentation in the temple, the Last Supper, you can make out the crucifixion pretty clearly in the middle, right? And these would have been hung underneath those panels. And this was fairly common in 15th century Italian pictures, or 14th century Italian pictures, to have the main body of the painting and then what's called a predella down below. And the main body doesn't tell a story. It just has isolated figures. And the predella then fleshes out the narrative. Usually the narrative is the life of Christ or the life of the Virgin Mary. Right? So we have 7 panels down below that seem to maybe go with these. And they help again to give us some context for Giotto's picture. They help us now to understand how this work was originally seen. Right? Now, so this is some of the context. He's choosing the Madonna and Child because it's in a church. Right? It's made for religious worship to be seen in the context of the performance of the Christian Mass, the Catholic Mass. Before we move on from that, one thing to say is that the churches were open, as they are now, outside of Masses. There were ample opportunity to see this without the priest. We don't know the degree to which people were doing this, right? Today it's tourism, right? We all go to Europe and we end up going to Notre Dame in Paris to see what's there. And we don't go when they're performing the Mass, right? We don't know the degree to which that was the case in the 14th century. Right? Okay. So he's choosing the Madonna and Child as a subject matter because of the original context. He's also choosing it because there is a long-standing tradition of images in half-length of the Madonna and Child being used as focuses for prayer, inspirations for the faithful. And these were produced en masse in Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, which we'll have a map coming up in just a second. These icons fell into particular types because each of them was believed to have been painted from life. So the closer they were to the tradition, the more special they became. And this is exactly the opposite of what we think about today when it comes to art, where we think the more original it is, the better it is, right? This art, Giotto's picture, picks up notoriety, it picks up efficacy, right? It's a better image because it follows type. Because that links it more closely to the original that people at this time believed the original painted by St. Luke himself. Right? Which is kind of anachronistic, but that didn't bother people. Right? So, the types fall into, and they're named, there's one where she's nursing him. In this case, it's called a Hodegatria icon. And what Hodegatria means in Greek is the one who points the way. And this accounts now for her hand coming across the front, directing your attention, pointing the way, Hodegatria, to Christ the Savior. And Giotto follows that, and we saw that similarity not only with Giotto's work, but also with the others that we had looked at. They were following this Hodegatria type. Right? And again, he's made innovations here, giving us the cute little finger and the rose that we talked about. Right? Now, as we look at Italian art from the 13th century, the tradition that Giotto builds on, it was strongly influenced by Byzantine art. Now, the Byzantine Empire is what is today Greece, many of the Balkan countries, Turkey, right? What often Europeans call Asia Minor, Lower Asia, right? And originally, up until around 1100 or so, numerous areas of Italy were also part of the Byzantine Empire. Okay? So there's Italy on the far left, Greece in the middle, Constantinople, used to be called Byzantium before Constantine moved there and named it after himself. Right? That's why we call it the Byzantine Empire. And in 320-ish, 310, 320, Constantine, the Roman emperor, leaves Rome, moves to this new town, right? Ditches Italy, sets up the Roman Empire in the east, names the capital after himself. For the next 1,000 years, there's an empire here, independent from the papacy, independent from Europe, the Byzantine Empire. And that's where the majority of these older icon traditions come from and continue to be used to this day and continue to be produced to this day. Right? Is from the remnants of the old Byzantine Empire. And it's still thriving in 1320. It finally falls to the Ottomans in 1454. Right? So at this point it's a thriving empire. And even though Italy had become independent from the Byzantine Empire by this time, there's still strong trade connections between Italy and the Byzantine Empire. So we continue to see influence coming from that in Italian art in the 13th century. That's why we call it Italo-Byzantine, right? Produced in Italy in the Byzantine style. That all make sense? Right? So these traditions really help, right? And Giotto is part of this tradition of sort of moving away from the Byzantine traditions. And our altarpiece we started with are part of the steps in that direction. Right? Now, the naturalism that Giotto brings to Byzantine art, if we go back to the icon, right? The increased sense of three-dimensionality, the increased sense of realism, right? The attempt to make the two-dimensional surface look as if there are three-dimensional things there, right? That increase in realism that we see in Giotto's work, strongly in Giotto's work, around 1300, we kind of see everywhere in Europe in the 13th century, particularly in France, where the Gothic style in France begins to give us significantly more three-dimensional figures, significantly more realistic imagery. There's an artist drawing in a manuscript, probably the manuscript we're looking at, and you can see the degree to which our anonymous French artist has tried to model the figure in three dimensions, even though the proportions are elongated and kind of spindly, right? But there still is this attempt to make him look like he's a three-dimensional thing. And what we see in Giotto's time, as Italy is moving further away from their trade connections with the Byzantine Empire, they're developing increasing trade connections with Northern Europe. In other words, the connections with France are getting stronger at this exact same time. So we might expect then that the innovations that French artists are coming up with, which is toward realism, should also have some impact on Giotto and Italian artists in general. And that is in fact the case. We even have records of some of Giotto's contemporaries having traveled to France, to Paris in particular. Right? So there's this cross-pollination of styles, right? Where they're shifting their focus away from the contacts with Byzantium. They'll still remain, right? But they're picking up more contacts with Northern Europe, and those trade contacts, that economic connection, leads to changes in art. Right? Another way we can explain Giotto's change in style is to think about the area where he's working. I told you that he worked everywhere in Europe, like 7 or 8 different cities, right? But he remained located in the city of Florence, north central Italy. And this is also an incredibly important element of his stylistic development. Because Florence was one of 2 cities in Italy at this time where almost modern capitalism begins to be practiced. Now, prior to Giotto, through the Middle Ages, there was a system of government wherein every city was part of a kingdom and was governed by a sort of system of land management that came from the king to dukes to counts, called feudalism, right? But beginning around the 1100s or so, 1150, 1200, Florence becomes a mercantile center, where instead of being born into a particular class where there is no mobility, this is the fact for feudalism. If you're born a peasant, you stay a peasant. Right? If you're born a lord, you can stay a lord. There's no mobility. Right? But in Florence, beginning around 1100, with the rise of trade, economic trade, right, we begin to see people who can make their own station in society. You can get rich through practicing a trade well. And these people who get rich want to buy the things that the old rich people used to have, like art. And on a certain level, they emulate what they had, but they also want something that reflects their own interests. And these people, these new merchants, right, who are now self-governing and independent from feudal oversight, they want an art that reflects their interests in the material world. So when we think about Giotto making things look more materialistic, look more realistic, we can draw a parallel between that and the changing interests of the people paying for them. People supporting it. Right? Now, as we think about Florence, there's another thing that we can bring into the discussion. Insofar as Giotto's change in style, right? We've already talked about shifting trade from Byzantium to France. We've already talked about the change in patronage from old feudal overlords to this new mercantile class. There are also changes to religious practice. Right? This was what gave rise to painting on panels in the first place. In fact, we don't see many Italo-Byzantine panels prior to the middle of the 13th century, because that's when they started to be used in church services. During Giotto's time, we see an increase in a new kind of practice when it comes to religion. In the middle of the 13th century, something fairly drastic changed in Italian religious practice. And this something was the rise of 2 new orders of monks. Okay, so monasticism, right, monks. The earliest monks are probably 4th century in the East, in Egypt, in the Byzantine Empire, and around the 6th century in Western Europe, right? And monks, you guys know what? They take a vow of poverty and isolate themselves from the world in order to devote their hearts and their lives to God, without the distraction of women, money, all those things out there, right? Live a pure ascetic lifestyle. Okay? And this begins in the 6th century in Western Europe, which is most important for Italy. The founder of monastic practice was Saint Benedict of Nursia. He established a series of rules by which monasteries, where the monks lived, would be governed. They would hear the rule read to them every day. They pray 7 hours in the day. The first at 3 in the morning, right? Early to bed, early to rise. Right? And separated from the cities. Okay? This was the norm. In the 13th century, there were two different people, not saints yet, soon to be saints, who decided that this idea of separating yourself from the city meant that you don't have any kind of social impact. That really, your calling to follow God means that you need to do something to help your fellow man, rather than just helping yourself. And help other people's salvation as well. These two saints were St. Francis of Assisi, after whom the Pope has taken his name, right, the current Pope, and St. Dominic. Right? And both St. Francis and St. Dominic, they're both at the same time, around 1220, 1230. Both of them said, we as monks need to re-engage with society. So instead of having monasteries out in the countryside, they had monasteries in the city. This raised some problems for the Franciscans, followers of St. Francis, the Dominicans, the followers of St. Dominic. It raised problems for them. Out in the countryside, you can be self-sufficient. You've got acreage. Raise your own crops, right? Herd your own cattle. You don't need anybody's help. Monastery in the city, you don't have the acreage. How do you survive? They ended up asking for donations. That's what the term mendicant means. Literally begging. Right? They would ask for alms for the support of the monastery. The mendicant orders. The Franciscans and the Dominicans. So in Florence, they are very, very prominent. Both the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Church of Santa Croce, the Holy Cross, in Florence, is the home church to the Franciscans. And eventually became the burial site of the most prominent people in Florence. I think Michelangelo's buried there. Right? I think Dante might be buried there as well. Right? Really prominent burial site. Okay? So this church dates around 1296, 1297 or so. Right around Giotto's time. A new church there for the Franciscans. Okay? So now this rise of the mendicants, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, their presence in Florence, where Giotto is painting, also seems to have an impact on his interest in realism, in making the Madonna child look like you and me. Because one of the things that the Franciscans did, it wasn't enough just to be back in the city, you had to reach out. And both the Franciscans and the Dominicans were preaching monks. They would go into the streets and preach the gospel on street corners in cities. And unlike hearing a church service in a church, a mass in the church, they would do it in the vernacular language. They're not talking Latin, which people don't understand. They were speaking the language of the people. And in order to reach out to them, in order to engage them with the biblical stories and make it relevant to them, they would flesh it out. They would really focus on sort of the human details. And when we look at Franciscan sermons, and we look at the kind of literature that's growing up around religion in the 13th century, what we find is we start to get things that aren't backed up in the Bible, but which give it more vibrancy in life. That give it the stories, make them more credible and engaging. Tell us things about the Virgin Mary that makes it to other women, oh, I understand what that's all about. Even though there's this miracle in the middle of it. Right? Flesh it out with details that reflect everyday life that made the story come alive. Right? That's happening. That's flowering at the same time Giotto is altering the traditional style towards something more realistic, something more like everyday life. Right? So there seems to be a very, very direct connection now with three different things we've been talking about, right? The realism coming from France, enhanced by a new merchant class who's really interested in a realistic kind of art, and new religious practices, a new religious environment that also is focusing on realism. All of those things lie at the core of Giotto's change. Right? It should also mention that we're pretty sure this guy was originally in Santa Croce. Remember the predella that we saw at the bottom? Right? Here's the inside of Santa Croce. Right? So the high altar is at the far end, and there's chapels off to the sides. Right? And these would be supported, the chapels, supported by prominent merchant families. And the more money you have, the closer you have your chapel to the main altar. There's a hierarchy, right? And high rent up here and low rent back here. None of them were low rent, but lower rent, right? And we're pretty sure that Giotto's altarpiece was in one of those side chapels, supported now by one of this new merchant class, made for a Franciscan context. And the reason we think that is one of those predella panels that we saw at the bottom, the crucifixion scene. There's a Franciscan monk kneeling at the foot of the cross, praying. So that makes sense that it came from a Franciscan context. Right? We also know from, we talked about the biographer Vasari, V-A-S-A-R-I, Giorgio Vasari, who wrote about the history of Renaissance art in the 1550s. When he writes his biography of Giotto, he mentions that there are 7 different altarpieces here by Giotto. Originally. So there's also 2 chapels that he has frescoes in, maybe 3 chapels that he has frescoes in as well. Right? So it's a kind of hotbed of new art around 1400. A lot of which gets replaced as new art becomes old art. Right? Okay. So this is our historical context. It helps us to explain not only subject matter, right, but also helps us to explain some of the changes in style that we're seeing. And that's the sort of thing we'll be doing again and again, is sort of trying to link what we're looking at to what was going on at the time. How can we explain this phenomenon that we can describe? What made Giotto do the things he did? Right? Now, like I mentioned, Giotto was kind of everywhere. We're going to look. This painting is part of a series of frescoes that he did. One of his most important works of art, and arguably, if you're going to pare down the history of Western art to 15 objects, this would probably be one of them. Right? Not this particular painting, but the entire suite. Giotto became so famous for this new style that, like I said, he worked everywhere in Italy. And in this particular case, he's working in the city of Padua, which is just outside of Venice, and quite a ways away from his hometown of Florence. His fame had spread. He was commissioned. A local moneylender, banker, commissioned this piece from Giotto for a chapel that he had built for his own private use, the Arena Chapel. Right? Fascinating bit about the Arena Chapel, you could never look at it like this because you don't get scaffolding, but there are only windows on one side of the chapel. The other wall is blank. We think Giotto maybe designed the chapel because it seems as if it was designed as a place to put frescoes. It's not like just a chapel that's built like every other chapel. And the light from that side lights this wall very well. You get this uninterrupted suite of frescoes. And you can see I've highlighted where ours is in the suite at the bottom on the left. Right? So something like 38 different scenes here. They start at the bottom, top, they read to the bottom, and they show us the life of the Virgin Mary, followed by the infancy of Christ, his youth, right? Followed by his adult life, followed by his death. Right? 38 different narrative scenes of the life of Christ. And this all was paid for, as I mentioned, by a local merchant in Padua named Scrovegni, Enrico Scrovegni, who was fairly infamous as a moneylender. He loaned money out, if that's the right word, on interest, which in the Middle Ages was kind of bad, right? It actually was a sin. They called it usury, loaning out money at interest. Say that to your student loan officer, right? You're sinning when you ask him payment back, right? His father was so infamous for this that actually in Dante's Inferno, right? You know Dante's Inferno, right? It goes down into hell. He meets Enrico Scrivani's dad in hell. That's how famous he was, right? So Scrivani commissions this chapel with these frescoes as a place for him to pray privately. He probably needs it. And the idea is also probably to get his father out of purgatory, right? And help pray the family back to good status with God, right? So John was commissioned to do the frescoes, and we're not going to look at a lot of them. I want to talk about fresco, right? The term fresco, which you probably have heard before, is the Italian word for fresh. So we can dining al fresco, right? Dining in the fresh air. Fresco as a painting technique and a painting term means fresh. And the reason they use the term is that it's a water-based paint. Now, different kind of medium, right, than what we were looking at before. It's not tempera on a panel, a wooden panel. This is water-based paint on wet plaster, thus fresco, right? Fresh plaster. And it doesn't work if the plaster dries, although they will put finishing touches after it's dry, because once it's dry, and you can add some nice details. Right? But the majority of it is laid down while the plaster is wet, because the reaction of the pigments in the water, the reaction of that between that and the lye or the lime that's in the plaster creates a sort of a chemical bond, and it becomes almost indestructible. Almost, right? Very, very durable. Okay? It becomes part of the wall. And what that means is that essentially you can only paint into wet plaster. Artists become very skilled about exactly how much they think they can paint in a given day, because they can't keep it wet overnight, right? So the scenes that you see everywhere, each of those kind of represents a day's work. And you'll notice that the seams are much bigger up above where he's just painting blue sky, and much smaller down below where he's painting faces. It's much more difficult, right? So they would lay down as much plaster as they could, paint it, come back the next day, lay down another section, paint it. That's how we would progress through painting this fresco, right? There's a close-up where we can see the line of the daily work. The angels who are lamenting. Okay, so the subject matter here, right? This is Christ. This is one of our 38 scenes toward the end. It's at the bottom, right? This is after he's been crucified. He's dead. He's been taken down from the cross, and he's about to be buried. This particular scene is not described in the Bible, a moment where they gather around the dead body of Christ. It's fleshing out the scene to make it more emotionally engaging. And so at this particular moment, right, as Christ has died, his followers have gathered around and they are mourning his death. None of them know that he's going to rise from the grave, except the Virgin Mary. But she's his mom. She's still sad. You know? The rest of them have no idea that Easter's coming. Right? So this is this moment of human drama, where the man that they've been following for the apostles for the last 3 years has now been tortured to death. And they've watched it happen. Right? And Giotto wants us to react with similar emotions to the apostles. He wants to engage us with the scene, in keeping with this new Franciscan tradition. And so he gives us this array of figures around Christ, all of whom are sad, but in kind of different ways. The figures on the right-hand border, for example, are fairly stoic, at the same time moping. And as we get closer and closer to Christ, we find people sadder and sadder and sadder, to the point where they're flailing about as they weep. The man in red, St. John, and you can see some of the details that were added as the plaster dried. They call that al secco in the dry versus al fresco in the wet, right? But notice how Giotto is focusing, even though the anatomy is a bit off, right? We see his eye kind of from the front, even though we should see it from the side. Right? But still, he's focusing on the red in his eyes to give him that sense of having been crying. His mouth is again opening. I think he wants us to hear this picture. Right? And he wants us to understand the pain that they're feeling, right? And bringing it through with this really wonderful three-dimensional modeling. We used that word chiaroscuro on Tuesday, right? The three-dimensional modeling, but also the focus on the humanity of the scene. Seated at the foot of Christ and holding his wounded feet. You can see the place where the nail went through, right? This is Mary Magdalene. Now, in the biblical story, earlier in her life, before she's converted, Mary Magdalene comes to the feet of Christ and washes them with her hair. She has an ointment jar, and she sort of, not washes them, but anoints them, if you will, with her hair. So she's almost always shown with her hair out, because she used to be a prostitute as well, and women with their hair out in the 14th century were seen as being a bit more loose, right? But now, at this moment, she's recalling what happened before. What it was like to be at the feet of Christ when he was alive. And now he's dead. And that pain, that suffering, that sadness distorts her once beautiful face. Amid all of this is the Virgin Mary. She's just, you can't believe this is happening. And Giotto really focuses on this idea of the humanity. And one of these, I mentioned the literature around the Bible started growing at this time, right? And one of the sources tells us that, and again, this is not in the Bible, right? But this has been familiar to people in the 14th century. It tells us that when the Virgin cradled the lifeless body of her son, she remembered holding him as a child, right? Just after he was born. And Giotto is kind of pulling on that as well, just as the Magdalene at the feet of Christ is also remembering their interactions with him while alive. So again, much like the naturalism we saw in our work of art, we're also seeing this interest in the humanity of the scene. Primary focus of the image is the humanity of the scene. At the same time, Giotto is deriving a lot of the overall composition from traditions, right? It's innovation within a tradition. And so there were earlier paintings of the Lamentation from the Byzantine Empire. So this is, 100 years earlier, 150 years earlier, where we can see the lifeless body of Christ, the Virgin Mary cradling him, someone coming and grabbing his hand, figures at the feet, not exactly the same ones, the angels up above with their, I was thinking like jet rocket angels, half bodies leaving jet trails behind them, right? But look at Giotto's work compared to this. Look at how the folds are very schematic. Even the musculature is kind of schematic. Right? Look at how everything is arranged so nothing blocks our view of the body of Christ. Turn to Giotto. Musculature, drapery, hangs naturally, shaded in 3 dimensions. We get figures that we see from the back that give it less of a sense of being artificially staged. Right? He's trying to make it an extension of our space, trying to make it natural and realistic. Yeah?
So in this one, to me, the figures in the Giotto piece look like they eat more.
They're better fed, yes.
They're better fed. Is that a reflection of the economic prosperity?
I don't think so. Now, that's a very good question. So Giotto's figures are bulky, right? Boxy and bulky. And the question is why? We often explain lots of things as sort of, we have to leave some room for the idea of certain things we see, right? One is this boxy brow with the sort of elongated eyes off to the side. I always think if you know old Saturday Night Live, it looks like Anna Gasteyer, who was on Saturday Night Live in the Will Ferrell era, right?
Yeah, Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene looks like her, so does the Virgin Mary, right? But there's boxy faces, right? And they have boxy bodies. And even though the figures are rendered in 3 dimensions with the idea of a light fading to shadow, there's also sort of a milk carton effect, you know? Especially the woman in green with her back to us. It sort of seems like a box. So that sturdy bulkiness is kind of a Giotto thing.
And the faces with like more chin and
yeah, they're also very boxy again, right? They're very kind of squared off, as are the eyes. That's a Giotto thing. So if you were, and it helps us to distinguish Giotto from, we're going to look at another artist from the same period. It makes it very easy to distinguish Giotto's works from other artists around 1300. And as well as the stuff that kind of looks like this but sucks, before, by some followers, pupils of Giotto, that probably came in a lower rent, right? And we've got some of those floating around as well. Okay? So that's a good question. And it brings up the point that I try to explain everything as if it's got some sort of socioeconomic basis. But sometimes we have to believe that art is art. Right? And there's got to be room within that for people to say, I just kind of like it this way. You know? And it could be that they're better fit.
Their skin looks like it's kind of hanging off of them and they're more muscular.
Yeah.
Here
that would require, and I could trace that through a lot of art in the 1100s, because that's the sort of artificiality that Gothic art begins to develop out of as well. We see this sort of style with these. They look like almost like paisley patterns on the drapery. We see that everywhere. We see it in Germany. We see it in France in the 1100s, right? Other little things, right? Look at Giotto's ground plane, right? Now the figures don't cast shadows, right? But they do seem planted on a ground plane that goes back into space. Look at the basket and the bowl on the left-hand side. You see that little two-handled urn. You see it from the side, but then you see the opening from the top, right? And the basket's tipped up at us as well, right? It doesn't have that sense of extending our space. And what we're seeing with Giotto with his interest in this three-dimensionality, right? Really. We're seeing what's going to set the stage for European art all the way to the 20th century. It's not only mid-19th century, right? It's not things like Cubism, where you start to say, hey, wait a second. The painting isn't a window through which we're looking. And that's really what Giotto's creating here, is the misperception on your part that the surface of the wall disappears. And you're not looking at the surface of the wall, you're looking through it to an extension of our space. Does that make sense? Right? So it's a bit of a trick, this interest in modeling in 3 dimensions. Perspective will add to that when they figure that one out, right? That it extends our space. But that idea of it extending your space means that this is relevant to you, right? This is part of your world, which is exactly what the Dominicans and Franciscans are doing with their preaching and the same sort of change we see with extra-biblical religious literature, right? This is like your life. Back here.
I noticed with several of Giotto's paintings last class, compared to a lot of the more traditional approaches, the skin tone on a lot of them were much darker, and as it changes, they become almost like a ghastly, even.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to say the question loud so that this picks it up a little bit as well, just in case. The change in skin tone from that sort of very darkened, deeply suntan look from the earlier Madonnas that we saw from the National Gallery to what Giotto has, or between these two, right? The paler skin tone. I don't have an answer to it, but I do have something that we need to consider. Okay? One is that we're not looking at these things fresh. We're looking at these things 800 years, 700 years later. Okay? Paint changes through time, and the changes that paint undergoes through time is based on a number of different factors. One is whatever paint they might use, which varies from picture to picture to picture to picture. The other is the sort of environment it was stored in, right? Heat, humidity. These things will alter in the same way if you go back and look at things in your basement. Some things have gotten grayed out, right? So this can be a factor in what we're looking at. Okay? That's one thing to consider. That's why I don't have an answer, right? Because I don't know the chemical analysis of these two paints to tell you, oh yeah, that one was different.
Was this a fresco?
This was a fresco
And
as
the
well.
other one was on wood?
Wood. But these two are frescoes, and the two that we saw on wood were both, like Giotto's had a lighter skin to them. Okay? That's one thing, is the materials and how they've changed over the course of centuries, right? Some paints we know change more drastically than others. There are some greens that we know go black on us, right? Certain blues that are not aquamarine, which is lapis lazuli, other blues will also turn black on us, okay? We call them, I love this term, conservators call it fugitive pigments. Running away from the law, right? Okay, so that's one thing to consider, is the state of preservation of the work. Tied into that is restorers' actions, conservators' actions over the years. The Giotto picture, when I moved here in 2005, looked totally different than it does now because it got cleaned about 3 years ago. Stripped off some old varnish that was graying down. That orange that you saw underneath her, man, you couldn't see that before, right? And the green kind of looked mucky. Now it just looks vibrant and alive, right? So that's another thing to consider. One museum might have it pretty well cleaned up, and National Gallery does a fantastic job of this, right? Another might not have that kind of money, and it's still under a cloudy 19th century varnish that's protecting it, right? And sometimes you can't even clean it off, because if you do, all the paint comes off as well, right? That's the conservator's job, is to figure out if it's safe to clean it or not. Okay? So that's another thing to consider. And with that also comes the fact that museums, when it comes to presenting works of art, will fill in areas that have been lost. This is not unethical at all, right? Who wants to look at a picture that's missing an eyeball? So they'll fill it in, but they'll fill it in well, and this is why art conservators have a dual degree in 3 degrees: studio art, art history, and chemistry, right? Because they need to be able to mix the paints, and they put down paints that don't. If you look close enough, you can find it, right? They're not trying to trick you, but they want to make the viewing experience nice. So these are things to consider. One other thing to consider, and this is a very important thing as well, is what we're looking at here in the classroom is about 5 steps removed from what it looks like in reality. Right? Somebody took a picture. I didn't take this one. Right? Someone took that picture. Someone digitized that picture that they took, or it was a digital camera. We don't know. Someone uploaded it to the internet somewhere. Maybe did some color corrections on it. Right? I look at it. I download it. I Photoshop it to get it the right size so that my PowerPoint's not too heavy. If I don't like the way the color looks, I don't think it looks right, I might do a little bit of color manipulation on it. Then it gets to this computer, which looks different than the other one. It's beamed by Wi-Fi to that projector. All of these steps can wash things out. So the paleness that you mentioned at the very end would be the thing that you'd be most careful with. Because, again, this is a very artificial engagement with the object, which is exactly why I said on Tuesday, hey, for this assignment, get down there. Go see it. Right?
This is down there.
No. This is still on the wall. It's stuck to the wall in the Arena Chapel. However, conservators have ways of getting frescoes off the wall. It's really fascinating. What they'll do is they put a fabric over the top of it with glue, right? Water soluble glue is very easy to move. And then they'll start to wet it, and they can actually roll it off the wall and roll it up somewhere else. So if you go to the National Gallery, there's actually a couple of frescoes down there from a villa in Italy, late 1400s, early 50s that have been transferred, right? And that's a whole thing in itself, right? Painting conservation is, or just art conservation in general. But this is how things get there, right? So if you go to the Baltimore Museum of Art, they've got some wonderful mosaics from like the 3rd century that were pulled off in kind of the exact same way, right? You can remove them from the wall, and they don't do it tile by tile by tile by tile, right? Okay, so that's the long answer to the question is this idea. What do I have coming up next? I got a word here. Chiaroscuro. I think I mentioned this before, right? Giotto's modeling in chiaroscuro is one of the major differences in this. Now, let's see. We've been talking about why he's doing this, right? We've been talking about influences on it. We talked about 3 sort of social influences from the 14th century. But did Giotto actually invent this idea of rendering in chiaroscuro? And the answer to that is probably not. But rather, Giotto is influenced by other things he's seen. Some of this might be works of art from France. We talked about that a little bit. But the other thing, and this might account a bit for the boxiness, a little bit, is he's looking back at Roman art. Ancient Roman frescoes, which are available in various sites throughout Italy. This one wasn't. Pompeii wasn't discovered until the 1830s, right? But it's a nice example because it's so well preserved because, you know, it's covered in ash, right? And that sealed it there. Nobody tore the buildings down. But that chiaroscuro modeling, and look at the figure at the man's feet, and then look back at Giotto's figures, right? And like I said, he didn't see this, but he saw other paintings from this time period. This was a hallmark of Roman wall painting, right? Roman frescoes. Was modeling in 3 dimensions, was a sense of realism. Giotto is reviving that after the Byzantine tradition, right? What he's moving away from with that is a revival of something much older, right? So his innovation is instead a rebirth, right? And it's for this reason that we usually talk about Giotto as being the first artist of the Renaissance. Because the word Renaissance means rebirth. They didn't use the word Renaissance then, it's a French term. It didn't gain currency until sort of the 18th century. But they were talking about looking back. Looking back at ancient Rome. Looking back at ancient Greece. Right? And reviving that in order to start something new, in order to break from these traditions. They were very self-aware. They didn't like what was going on in Europe insofar as the arts were concerned, whether it's literature or visual art. They saw it as being too French. They didn't like the French, right? And they're the ones who coined the term Gothic. The Goths, the savage tribes of Northern Europe, right? Not just French. Bad French. And they talk about a rebirth of this glorious period of Italian history that the Goths had overthrown back in the 4th century. Right? A rebirth of classical styles. So the same sort of modeling that we see in Giotto is something that we see back in ancient Roman art. And that idea of rebirth is why when we talk about Giotto, we talk about it as the birth of the Renaissance. Why when Vasari wrote the lives of the artists, he says it all starts here, right? The first light of the Renaissance. Now, he's not the only one doing this around 1300. Other artists are well. It's a movement. Giotto is just one of the more famous artists in that movement. There are other artists who are equally interested in realism, in naturalism, in humanity, as Giotto is. Duccio is one of them. They probably met each other at some point, even though they spent most of their lives in different cities. Duccio worked in Giotto's Florence at one point, major commission there, before moving back to his hometown. Now, we'll talk about that hometown in just a second. This is a wonderful, one of my favorite pictures of the National Gallery. I'm actually one of the, the people in the National Gallery were going to, if there was a comet coming and you're going to save a picture, this might be one of the ones they'd run out with because it's got an incredibly important history behind it. But it's the birth of Christ, okay? So notice, like Giotto, that he models the figures very well in 3 dimensions. But going back to your question, I don't have the names memorized yet, but going back to your question, is it as boxy as Giotto? Significantly less, right? In fact, it's a little bit more delicate, right? Look at the Virgin's hands. Look at the proportions of her face, right? I don't think you'd ever really mistake a Duccio for a Giotto. Because Duccio just has a sort of like a porcelain delicacy to it. You know, it's lyrical. Whereas Giotto's just sturdy, you know, muscular, right? And all of the figures, the angels, even the other figures around, right? The Virgin Mary in the center have a certain daintiness to them. It's kind of lovely, charming. Right? I think you ever called Giotto charming, although that finger thing is kind of cute, right? So, Duccio's work and Nativity from roughly the same time. What we have, the Nativity, is the birth of Christ. Now, it's never really the birth of Christ, right? It's the moment after the birth of Christ, because you're not going to see, you know, Jesus crowning out or something like that, right? It's not going to happen. So, but we call it the Nativity, which is the word for the birth of Christ. So there's the Virgin Mary. She's looking at Jesus, who's just been born. He's on the manger there with a donkey and an ox. You know, going like, who's this in my dinner tray, right? And I've got some really nice details of this to show you, right? And there's, I guess he's looking up a little worried, thinking, them animals look hungry. But you see that Duccio's painted the straw in the manger, and the animals are just really cute, aren't they? They're kind of like they're talking to each other or something. And these 2 animals always appear at the Nativity. I don't know if it's in the Bible or not. I don't think that it is, right? But in pictures, they're always there. Ox and a donkey. And the reason they're there is symbolic. Well, the reason they're there is like, A, art loves tradition. They don't like to break with traditions, and they're traditionally there. But why are they traditionally there? They were explained by theologians as being symbolic. An ox does what it's told. It represented Christians. Donkeys are belligerent. They never do what they're told. They're the Jews. Hear the message of the Savior and resist it. Anti-Semitic, right? But that's how they explain it. So what they're meant to represent here, because they're both sort of looking down, the entirety of the world present, symbolically, at the Nativity, right? Notice again the tooled gold background on Christ's halo, right? This entire picture, right? The central panel is about like yay, right? Maybe 18 inches square. So the details are good. And you can tell by the crack pattern, which tends to be about the same size everywhere. Each of those cracked panels, half a fingernail or so, maybe a fingernail. Right. Who's that? Who do you suppose is there with the Virgin Mary, Christ? Who's this old man on the left?
Joseph?
Who said that? Yes, Joseph, right? Mary's husband, Joseph, who in the Bible is mentioned as being older than she is. When they married, she was like 13 or 14. Sort of sounds like Alabama politics, but you know, Joseph is older, right? He remains older throughout the visual tradition because it's important that he's older. Because he's not Christ's dad, physically, right? He's Christ's stepfather. He is not the biological father. Pre-Viagra, he ain't it, right? And you'll notice that this is kind of subtle, but it's important. He's not inside the manger. There's kind of separation. She's in, he's out. And we see that repeatedly, where Joseph, A, older, which is biblically supported, but also symbolic, and B, separated from things that refer to the birth, because he isn't part of that, right? So very good. Joseph over here, and when is he told? I don't know my Bible well enough. When is he told? Right? There's a certain point an angel appears to Joseph and says, "Hey, don't sweat it." Right? She didn't cheat on you. You know, it's God. And I think it's before the birth that takes place, right? But he still kind of looks skeptical, doesn't he? Like, what's with this baby stuff? right? I know I haven't done anything. And it's the humanity, right? It's I don't think it's meant to be funny, but it is sort of meant to be this. These are real human reactions.
He's also very short compared
He's kneeling down, right? So he's down like this, right? So if he were to stand there, because there's his foot, there's his shin, and he's kind of swaddled up underneath. She's huge though. Yeah, and it's not so much that he's small, but you'll notice that throughout the scale varies drastically. So Joseph is smaller than the Virgin Mary. The two women in the foreground are smaller still. The two guys in the lower right corner are small, right? So the group on the front, which should be bigger, is in fact the smallest, right? And then Joseph a different scale, Virgin Mary a different scale. This is because the scale is not about perspective yet. The scale is about importance, right? The term for this, the $10 term, hieratic scale, hierarchy, right? Hieratic scale, H-I-E-R-A-T-I-C, hieratic scale. And we see this used in art regularly, right? Where the important things are the biggest things. I want to get to the last thing stuff. I'm going to avoid this cute little story about a kid drawing in the National Gallery. Who are those guys? Lower right corner. Those are the shepherds. Why do you think that? Because they're there. Because they're supposed to be there, right? Is there anything in the picture, if you didn't know that would tell you that they're shepherds? The sheep, exactly right. And he's a cute little dog too, right? You know me and my dog. I love dogs. I've got 2 dogs at home. Yeah, sheep in front of them. So also you notice that their clothes are ragged, right? They're impoverished. And also one of them is carrying a bagpipe. And throughout medieval literature and imagery, we often see that the shepherds are musical. And in fact, there were biblical plays that were staged in churches where they would play their instruments and they stunk. They were like, and then the angel would appear and all of a sudden they played beautiful melodies, right? That became a symbol of their conversion. So here the angel is actually appearing to them. The words have worn off the scroll. They say, hey, over there's where the miracle's happening, right? So this is we call this the annunciation to the shepherds, the announcement to the shepherds. And they're looking up to see, and they're not really aware that that giant virgin is right there, right? They're going to turn and go. This one is a little bit more difficult, and then we'll quit after this, right? In the foreground, we see 2 women who are midwives, women that assist in childbirth. And I don't think that they're mentioned in the Bible, but they're there, included by Duccio, to make the scene that much more realistic. That much more like women's experiences in 1308, where a childbirth would be accompanied by professionals. And the baby then is Jesus again, a second time. Right? So within a single frame, we see a continuous narrative, right? Time elapses and we see actually 2 different scenes of Jesus in the same picture. Okay? Now, I'm sorry we're over by a minute or so. I try not to do that often, but I did want to get through that part of it. So on Tuesday, you have your first worksheet due, and I will send it to you in a second or 2, right? And the following Tuesday is to register your 3 works of art. Many people have already done that. And I'm getting back to you slowly but surely because I'm reading through my emails on that. So Tuesday's after. Tuesday we'll be finishing up 14th century and moving to the next section, which is called International Gothic stuff, around 1400. Okay. So we should be able to wrap this up on Tuesday and move into the next section. Okay? Good. I'll see you guys then next week.